They told Michael Harrison the abandoned military base was worthless scrap metal buried in Arizona desert sand, and the 14 men with cash in their pockets who attended the government surplus auction didn't even raise their paddles when the bidding started. But Michael saw an opportunity where others saw only heat-scorched buildings and rusted metal, not realizing he was about to buy the biggest secret the United States government had tried to bury for 80 years. He explored a desert military base, then discovered it was built over something older, something that would connect him to his own grandfather's hidden past and expose a nuclear secret that powerful people had killed to protect. Before we get into this incredible story, smash that subscribe button right now and drop a comment telling us what state you're watching from. We love hearing from our viewers across America. Now let's dive in. Michael Harrison stood in the back of the government surplus auction warehouse outside Phoenix, wiping sweat from his forehead despite the air conditioning that struggled against the Arizona heat pressing through every crack in the building. He was 67 years old, a retired Army combat engineer who'd spent 30 years building bridges and clearing minefields in places most Americans couldn't find on a map. His pension covered rent and groceries with nothing left over, and the $3,000 in his checking account represented every penny he'd managed to save over the past 2 years by eating ramen and skipping his daughter's suggestions that he visit more often. The auctioneer, a thin man whose voice had gone hoarse from shouting lot numbers all morning, cleared his throat and consulted his list. Lot 42, Yucca Flat Station, decommissioned military installation, 30 acres with structures sold as is, no guarantees, minimum bid $3,000. Do I hear 3,000? Michael raised his paddle, a simple movement that would change everything, though he had no way of knowing that yet. He was thinking about scrap metal prices, about the tons of steel and copper wiring that old military bases contained, about how $15,000 profit would let him sleep at night without worrying about next month's rent. The auctioneer's gavel came down with a sharp crack that echoed through the warehouse, and just like that, Michael owned a piece of the Arizona desert that nobody else had wanted. The clerk who processed his paperwork was young, maybe 25, with the bored expression of someone who'd handled hundreds of these transactions and found them all equally uninteresting. She slid a thick manila envelope across the counter without making eye contact. Deed, survey maps, decommissioning report from 1991. Base was built in 1952 as a Cold War listening post. Shut down when the Soviets collapsed. Been empty ever since. Michael opened the envelope and pulled out a yellowed survey map that showed the base layout in precise detail. 3 large hangars on the north perimeter, 2 barracks buildings, several smaller support structures, and a command center. The map was dated April 1952, with a notation at the bottom that read, "Constructed on site of previous installation, all prior structures removed per DoD Directive 7-42. Something about that notation bothered him, though he couldn't immediately say why. Previous installation meant something had been there before 1952, but the notation claimed all prior structures had been removed. Yet the survey map showed the main hangar sitting on a foundation that extended 4 feet above ground level, which was unusual for aircraft hangars that typically sat flush with the desert floor for easier equipment access. Michael had built enough military structures during his career to recognize when something didn't match standard construction practices. He drove out to Yucca Flat Station the next morning, his pickup truck pulling a small trailer loaded with tools he'd need for salvage work. The drive took 2 hours, winding through desert landscape that grew increasingly desolate with each passing mile. Red sand stretched to distant mountains that shimmered in heat waves, and the only signs of civilization were occasional power lines that marched across the horizon like skeletal fingers. The base entrance appeared suddenly, a gap in a chain-link fence that had been cut open by salvagers years ago, though apparently nobody had found anything worth taking. A weathered sign still clung to the fence post, its paint faded but letters still legible. Yucca Flat Station, authorized personnel only. Trespassers will be prosecuted. Michael drove through, noting how his tires left the first fresh tracks in sand that looked like it hadn't been disturbed in decades. The base was larger than he'd expected from the survey map, sprawling across flat desert like the skeleton of something that had died and been left to bleach in the sun. The 3 hangars dominated the northern section, their metal roofs partially collapsed, their walls showing rust patterns that spoke of 30 years of neglect. The barracks buildings looked more intact, though every window had been broken and doors hung at odd angles. creaking in the hot wind that never seemed to stop blowing across the desert. Michael spent his first hour walking the compound, his combat engineer's eye automatically assessing structural integrity and salvage value. The hangars held thousands of pounds of steel beams. The barracks had copper wiring in the walls that scrap yards would pay premium prices for. Even the chain-link fencing, despite its rust, represented money if he could cut it into manageable sections. But it was the main hangar, the largest of the three structures, that kept drawing his attention. Something about its foundation felt wrong in a way he couldn't immediately articulate. The concrete base extended 4 feet above ground level, just as the survey map had indicated, but now that he was standing next to it, he could see that the concrete wasn't just thick. It was reinforced in a way that made no practical sense for a simple aircraft hangar built in 1952. Michael grabbed a shovel from his trailer and began clearing sand from the base of the foundation wall, working in the brutal heat that made his shirt stick to his back and turned his mouth dry as dust. Within 20 minutes of digging, he understood why the foundation looked wrong. This wasn't just a foundation at all. It was a cap, a deliberate covering built over something that had existed before, something that someone had wanted to bury rather than demolish. 6 feet down, his shovel struck something that gave off a different sound than concrete, a metallic ring that made him stop and carefully clear more sand with his hands. What emerged was a section of steel reinforcement that had corroded in a pattern he recognized from his years of working with military construction materials. This steel was older than 1952, much older. The corrosion patterns, the grade of metal, even the way it had been welded, all spoke of 1940s construction techniques. Michael worked faster now, ignoring the heat and the way his back protested the constant bending and digging. Another hour of work exposed a steel plate embedded in the older concrete, and stamped into that plate were 3 letters that made his heart start pounding hard enough that he could hear it in his ears. Med Manhattan Engineer District. The code name that everyone who studied World War II history knew, though most people didn't understand what it really meant. The Manhattan Engineer District wasn't just the organization that built the atomic bomb. It was the cover name for dozens of secret facilities scattered across the American Southwest, places where scientists conducted experiments that would never appear in official records, places that were supposed to have been completely dismantled and erased from existence after the war ended. Michael's hand shook slightly as he pulled out his phone to photograph the steel plate, though he wasn't sure yet what he would do with the images. The base he'd bought for $3,000, thinking it was just Cold War scrap metal, had been deliberately built over a Manhattan project facility that official records claimed had been completely removed. Someone had gone to enormous trouble to bury this place under a new base rather than simply demolishing it, which meant something down there had been too important or too dangerous to fully destroy. He was so focused on the steel plate and what it meant that he didn't hear the vehicle approaching until it was very close, the sound of its engine suddenly cutting through the constant desert wind. Michael climbed out of the trench he'd dug and walked toward the base entrance, shading his eyes against the afternoon sun that turned the desert into a blast furnace. The vehicle was a black SUV, expensive and completely out of place in this desolate landscape, its paint job so perfect that it looked like it had just rolled off a showroom floor. It pulled up to the gate and stopped, engine idling, windows so darkly tinted that Michael couldn't see who was inside. For a long moment nothing happened, and he found himself thinking about how far he was from Phoenix, how nobody knew he was out here, how easy it would be for someone to disappear in this much empty desert. The driver's door opened, and a man stepped out into the heat, seemingly unbothered by temperatures that had to be pushing 110 degrees. He was maybe 58 or 60, wearing a suit that probably cost more than Michael's truck, with silver hair and the kind of confidence that came from never being told no. He removed expensive sunglasses and studied Michael with eyes that were calculating and cold. "Mr. Harrison," the man said, his voice carrying clearly across the 50 feet that separated them. "My name is Gordon Vance. I understand you purchased this property yesterday at the government auction." Michael felt his stomach tighten. How does someone know my name less than 24 hours after I bought this place? Word travels fast in certain circles, Vance continued, walking closer with measured steps. "I'm in the mineral extraction business, and I have an interest in this particular piece of desert. I'd like to make you an offer. $500,000, cash, transferred to your account today." The number hit Michael like a physical blow. $500,000 for something he'd paid $3,000 for yesterday. Nobody offers that kind of money unless they need something very, very badly. And whatever Gordon Vance needed, it was buried under 12 feet of sand and concrete right behind where Michael was standing. That's generous, Michael said carefully, his mind racing. But I just bought this place. Haven't even started salvage work yet. Don't see why I'd sell. Vance's expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes, something that looked like impatience or maybe worry. Mr. Harrison, let me be direct. The property you purchased has certain complications that you're not aware of. Complications that could become legal problems for you. I'm offering you a clean exit with substantial profit. What kind of complications? The kind that involve federal jurisdiction and classified materials. Vance gestured at the hangar behind Michael. That base wasn't just a Cold War listening post. It was built over something older, something that's still technically under government control even though they sold you the surface rights. If you start digging around, you're going to find things that will bring federal agents down on you faster than you can imagine. Michael thought about the steel plate 12 feet underground, about the letters MED stamped into metal that was 80 years old, about the fact that Gordon Vance knew exactly what was buried here, and was desperate enough to offer $500,000 to someone he'd never met. What's really down there, Mr. Vance? What's worth $500,000? Vance put his sunglasses back on, and his voice went flat. That's not your concern. What should concern you is that powerful people don't want what's buried here to be disturbed. Take my offer. Walk away rich. Or refuse and find yourself dealing with problems you can't imagine. Before Michael could respond, Vance reached into his jacket and pulled out a business card, extending it with fingers that were steady and assured. You have 24 hours to think about it. After that, the offer expires, and you'll be on your own with whatever consequences come from your decision. Vance walked back to his SUV, climbed in, and drove away, leaving Michael standing in a cloud of dust holding a business card that read, Gordon Vance, CEO, Vance Mineral Extraction, and a phone number with a New York area code. The entire encounter had lasted less than 5 minutes, but it had changed everything Michael thought he understood about his $3,000 purchase. He looked back at the hangar, at the foundation that wasn't just a foundation, at the trench he'd dug that revealed construction from 1940-something, and he realized that Gordon Vance wasn't trying to buy property. He was trying to buy silence. Whatever lay beneath this desert base was important enough that someone had been monitoring government surplus auctions, waiting for the day when an unsuspecting buyer would finally purchase Yucca Flat Station and potentially discover what had been buried there for 80 years. Michael pulled out his phone and called his daughter Rebecca, a physics professor at UCLA who specialized in nuclear history. When she answered, he could hear students talking in the background, the normal sounds of a university office that felt very far away from where he was standing. Rebecca, he said, his voice steadier than he felt, I need you to tell me everything you know about Manhattan Project facilities in Arizona. And then I need you to come out here, because I think I just found one that's not supposed to exist. Rebecca Harrison arrived at Yucca Flat Station 36 hours after her father's phone call, driving a rented SUV that looked absurdly clean against the desert landscape that seemed designed to coat everything in red dust within minutes. She was 41 years old with her mother's sharp features and her father's stubborn determination, and the moment she saw the trench Michael had dug beside the main hangar, her professional composure cracked just enough for him to see genuine shock cross her face. Dad, she said quietly, kneeling beside the exposed steel plate with the MED designation stamped into its surface. Do you understand what this means? This isn't supposed to exist. According to every declassified document I've ever read, all Manhattan Project facilities in Arizona were completely dismantled after 1945. Michael handed her a bottle of water from the cooler he'd brought, watching as she ran her fingers over the corroded steel with the careful touch of someone who understood exactly how significant this discovery was. That's what I thought too, he said. But somebody went to a lot of trouble to bury this place instead of demolishing it. Question is why. Rebecca pulled out a professional-looking device that Michael didn't recognize, something with a digital display and what looked like a sensor probe. She extended it toward the steel plate and watched the numbers climb on the screen, her expression growing more troubled with each passing second. I'm reading radiation signatures, she said. Not dangerous levels, but definitely elevated above background. Dad, whatever was happening down there involved radioactive materials, and if standard decommissioning procedures had been followed, these readings shouldn't exist. The implications settled over Michael like a weight pressing down on his shoulders. You're saying they sealed radioactive materials underground and then built a base on top of it? Just left it here? I'm saying something happened at this facility that made complete removal impossible or inadvisable, so they buried it deep, capped it with concrete and steel, and then constructed a new base on top to hide what was underneath and to monitor it. She stood up, dust covering her knees, and looked at the massive hangar that loomed above them. The 1952 base wasn't really about Cold War listening posts, was it? It was about keeping people away from what's buried below. Michael thought about Gordon Vance and his $500,000 offer, about the 24-hour deadline that had now passed without Michael making contact, about the way Vance had known exactly what was down here before Michael had even started digging. Somebody else knows about this, he said, and then explained about Vance's visit, about the offer, about the thinly veiled threats that had accompanied the business card that Michael had tucked into his wallet. Rebecca's face went pale in a way that had nothing to do with the brutal desert heat that surrounded them. Vance Mineral Extraction, she repeated. Dad, do you know what they do? They don't just mine minerals. They're one of the largest private contractors for radioactive material cleanup and disposal in the country. If Gordon Vance is interested in this site, it's because there's something down there worth a fortune on the black market. What do you mean, black market? Nuclear materials are some of the most tightly controlled substances on Earth, but there's still a thriving illegal trade, especially for certain isotopes that are hard to obtain legally. If this facility was doing weapons research in the 1940s, the materials they used, uranium, plutonium, even some of the rarer elements, those could be worth millions to the right buyers. Michael felt sick. So Vance doesn't want to clean this up. He wants to mine it. And if you're standing in his way, you're a problem that needs to be eliminated. Rebecca pulled out her own phone, her fingers already moving across the screen. We need to contact the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, the EPA, maybe even the FBI. This is way bigger than a property dispute. But before she could make the first call, they both heard what Michael had started to dread, the sound of vehicles approaching across the desert, multiple engines moving fast. They climbed out of the trench and walked to where they could see the access road, and Michael counted 4 vehicles, 2 black SUVs identical to the one Vance had driven, and 2 pickup trucks that looked designed for heavy desert work. The vehicles stopped at the gate and men began emerging, 8 of them, all wearing casual clothes that didn't quite hide the fact that they moved like people trained for violence. Gordon Vance stepped out of the lead SUV, and this time he wasn't alone. Next to him stood a woman in her 50s, professionally dressed despite the heat, carrying a briefcase that looked expensive and official. Mr. Harrison, Vance called out, his voice carrying clearly across the compound. I see you've brought reinforcements. Allow me to introduce Catherine Wells, attorney. She has some documents you'll want to see. Michael and Rebecca walked toward the gate slowly, Michael's hand instinctively moving to his hip, where he used to carry a sidearm during his Army years, though of course he was unarmed now. What kind of documents? Catherine Wells opened her briefcase with practiced efficiency and pulled out a thick folder. These are EPA reports from 1989, she said, her voice crisp and professional. They document radioactive contamination at this site. There's also a federal injunction preventing any excavation or disturbance of the soil without proper hazmat protocols. Your digging yesterday violated that injunction, Mr. Harrison. You're currently in violation of federal environmental law. Rebecca stepped forward, her professor's instinct to argue with flawed logic overriding her fear. That's impossible. If there was an EPA injunction on this property, it would have been disclosed during the auction. You can't sell contaminated land without informing buyers. Wells smiled, but there was no warmth in it. The injunction is sealed, classified under national security provisions. The general public doesn't have access to it, which is why the land could be auctioned. But now that you've disturbed the site, the injunction becomes active, and you're liable for all cleanup costs. How much are we talking about? Michael asked, though he already suspected the answer would be astronomical. Between $8 and $12 million, Wells replied. Of course, Mr. Vance's company specializes in exactly this kind of remediation. He's prepared to assume all liability and handle the cleanup in exchange for full ownership of the property. Michael laughed, a short, bitter sound. So either I sell you the property for whatever you want to pay, or I face millions in cleanup costs I can't afford. That's not an offer. That's extortion. That's federal environmental law, Wells countered. Take it up with the EPA if you disagree. Rebecca had been studying the documents Wells had handed over, her trained eye catching details that Michael would have missed. These reports are dated October 1989, she said slowly. But this base wasn't officially decommissioned until 1991. How could the EPA have documented contamination 2 years before the military even closed the facility? Wells' expression flickered just for a moment, and Michael saw something there that looked like uncertainty. The EPA can inspect military facilities if contamination is suspected, regardless of operational status. But Rebecca wasn't backing down. She pointed at a specific paragraph in the report. This section references test results from soil samples taken at depths of 15 to 20 feet. Dad, how deep is that trench you dug? About 12 feet, Michael answered. So these samples were taken from below the level you reached, which means someone had to dig deeper than you did to collect them. She looked at Vance. When did your company first visit this site, Mr. Vance? That's proprietary information. Because I'm guessing you've been out here before, probably multiple times over the years, testing and documenting what's buried below, waiting for the day when someone would finally buy this property so you could swoop in with your fake EPA reports and manufactured injunctions to force a sale. Vance's friendly demeanor dropped away entirely, replaced by something cold and calculating. You're making serious accusations, Miss Harrison. Accusations that could result in legal action against you. Michael felt a surge of pride watching his daughter stand her ground against men who were used to intimidating people into submission. Rebecca's voice stayed steady. I'm a nuclear physicist with clearance to access classified documents. I've spent 15 years studying Manhattan Project facilities. And I'm telling you that something about your story doesn't add up, which means tomorrow morning I'm contacting every federal agency I can think of to request documentation of this alleged contamination. One of the men standing behind Vance, a thick-shouldered guy with the flat eyes of someone who'd done violence before, moved his hand toward his belt. Michael's combat instincts, dormant for years, suddenly snapped into focus. He stepped in front of Rebecca, his body language shifting in a way that made the man pause. Gentlemen, Michael said quietly, his voice carrying the authority of 3 decades giving orders to soldiers. You're on my property, and if anyone makes a threatening move toward my daughter, I'm within my rights to defend her with whatever force necessary. The tension stretched for a long moment, desert wind the only sound breaking the silence. Finally, Vance raised a hand and his men backed down. Mr. Harrison, this doesn't have to be adversarial. We simply want to ensure proper environmental protocols are followed. Then file your paperwork through proper channels, Rebecca shot back. Request site access through the EPA. Follow the actual legal process instead of showing up with hired muscle to intimidate property owners. Vance's jaw tightened, and Michael could see him calculating odds, weighing options, deciding how far he was willing to push this confrontation. After several seconds, he nodded slowly. Very well. We'll be in touch through official channels, but I'd strongly advise you not to do any more digging until this is resolved, for your own safety. The men climbed back into their vehicles and drove away, leaving Michael and Rebecca standing in a cloud of dust, both of them shaking slightly from adrenaline that was just starting to fade. Rebecca leaned against the hangar wall, her professional composure finally cracking. Dad, what the hell did you buy? Michael looked at the trench, at the steel plate with its Manhattan Project designation, at the desert that stretched endlessly in every direction. I bought a secret, he said. A secret that someone's willing to kill to protect. And I think I know why. He pulled out the survey map from his truck and spread it across the hood, pointing to a notation he'd been studying since yesterday. Look at this. The base was built in 1952, but this map references prior structures being removed per DoD Directive 7-42. I looked up that directive last night. It was issued in August 1945, right after the atomic bombs were dropped on Japan. So? Rebecca studied the map more carefully. So the timing matters. Something was happening here in July or August 1945, something connected to the Manhattan Project. The official Trinity test happened in New Mexico in July. But what if there was another test? An unauthorized one? Rebecca's eyes went wide. Dad, if there was a secret nuclear test that's not in any official records, the contamination levels would be massive. And if it was unauthorized, if it happened without proper approvals, the political fallout alone would be enormous even 80 years later. Michael folded the map, his mind already racing ahead to what they needed to do next. Your grandfather, he said quietly. My dad. He was a physicist during the war. He worked on something classified, something he never talked about even 50 years later. When he died in 1968, there were papers. Your grandmother burned them like he'd asked, but I remember seeing them before she did. Letters, scientific notes, and at the top of several pages, I remember seeing 3 letters. What letters? Me D. Manhattan Engineer District. Rebecca, I think my father worked here. I think he was part of whatever happened at this facility. And I think that's why I'm standing on this property right now, because somehow I was always meant to find this. The sun was setting over the desert, painting the sky in shades of orange and red that made the landscape look like it was on fire, and Michael Harrison realized that buying this base for $3,000 had connected him to a family secret that had been buried for longer than he'd been alive, a secret that powerful men like Gordon Vance would do anything to keep hidden, and a secret that was about to tear open a conspiracy that had been successfully concealed for 80 years. Michael and Rebecca spent that night in a cheap motel 40 miles from the base, neither of them sleeping much, both understanding that staying at the property overnight would have been an invitation for Gordon Vance's men to return when there were no witnesses around to see what happened. But as the first gray light of dawn touched the desert horizon, they were driving back through landscape that looked somehow more ominous in the pale morning light, the kind of light that made everything cast long shadows and turned familiar shapes into something threatening. They're going to come back, Rebecca said, her hands tight on the steering wheel. Maybe today, maybe tomorrow, but they're not going to just file paperwork and wait for bureaucracy to work. Whatever's down there is worth too much. Michael had been thinking the same thing through the long, sleepless hours of the night. Then we need to get down there first. We need to see what's actually buried before Vance can destroy the evidence or seal it off with fake federal orders that will spend years fighting in court. The base looked exactly as they'd left it, which somehow made Michael more nervous rather than less. In his experience, when dangerous men said they'd be back, they usually meant it, and the fact that the property was still empty suggested they were planning something that required preparation rather than immediate action. He and Rebecca grabbed the tools from his truck, serious equipment this time, a gasoline-powered concrete saw he'd rented yesterday afternoon, heavy pry bars, a portable generator, and work lights that could turn night into day if necessary. The trench Michael had dug 2 days ago had partially filled with wind-blown sand, but the steel plate with its MED designation was still visible, still undeniable proof that this 1952 base had been built over something much older. Rebecca set up the generator while Michael started the concrete saw, its blade screaming as it bit into concrete that had been poured when Harry Truman was president, and the world was still learning to fear the atom. It took 3 hours of brutal work in heat that climbed past 100 degrees before noon, but gradually they cut away enough of the concrete cap to expose what lay beneath. Not just a foundation, as Michael had initially thought, but the roof of a structure that extended down into the earth, a bunker of some kind built with the kind of over-engineering that spoke of people who expected what they were building to last for centuries and to withstand forces that conventional structures could never survive. Michael found an access point around 2 p.m., a section where the concrete was thinner and the underlying steel had corroded enough that the pry bar could find purchase. Metal screamed as he levered against decades of rust and sealing, and then suddenly the section gave way with a sound like a gunshot, revealing darkness below and a rush of air that smelled like old paper and sealed time and something else, something chemical that made both of them instinctively step back. Rebecca pulled out her radiation detector, that same professional device she'd used yesterday, and extended its probe into the opening. The numbers on the display climbed, but not into dangerous ranges, just enough to confirm that whatever had happened in this buried facility had involved radioactive materials that were still present 80 years later. It's elevated but not immediately hazardous, she said, though her voice carried an edge of concern that Michael's parental instincts caught immediately. We can go down for a limited time, but we shouldn't stay long. They used work lights powered by the generator, lowering them through the opening on extension cords, and the illumination revealed a metal ladder descending into a chamber that looked like it had been sealed since the Eisenhower administration. Michael went first, his combat engineer training overriding the natural fear of descending into an unknown space that might have been contaminated with materials that could kill you so slowly you wouldn't know you were dying until it was too late. The ladder descended 20 feet, much deeper than Michael had expected, ending in a concrete chamber that was roughly 20 feet square with walls lined with what looked like lead panels. The center of the room held a large metal table, its surface covered with papers that had somehow survived 8 decades in this sealed environment, protected by the very isolation that had kept them hidden from the world above. Along one wall stood several filing cabinets, their drawers slightly open as if someone had left in a hurry without bothering to properly secure classified materials. Rebecca climbed down behind him, her work light casting sharp shadows as she swept it across the chamber. "Dad," she whispered, though there was no reason to whisper, except that this place seemed to demand silence the way churches and graveyards did. "This is an observation bunker. Look at those lead panels. This room was designed to let people monitor something happening nearby while protecting them from radiation." "Monitor what?" Michael asked, though he was starting to understand the answer even as the question left his lips. Rebecca walked to the table and carefully lifted one of the papers, her hands shaking slightly as she read the faded text. "This is a test protocol," she said, her voice barely audible. "Dated August 7th, 1945, 2 days after Hiroshima. It describes preparation for a secondary device test, unauthorized by the Manhattan Project Oversight Committee, to be conducted at coordinates that," she pulled out her phone and checked something, "that correspond exactly to where we're standing right now." Michael felt cold despite the stifling heat that had followed them down from the surface. "They tested a nuclear weapon here, in Arizona, 2 days after bombing Japan." "Not tested," Rebecca corrected, still reading the document with growing horror in her expression. "Detonated. This wasn't a test in the scientific sense. This was a disposal. They had a second bomb, probably a backup device in case the Hiroshima bomb failed, and once it wasn't needed, someone made the decision to detonate it in the desert rather than dismantle it properly." "Why would they do that?" "Because dismantling an armed nuclear weapon in 1945 was incredibly dangerous with the technology they had, and because the official Manhattan Project was already under intense scrutiny from Congress and the public. An unauthorized bomb that nobody was supposed to know about? Easier to make it disappear in a way that looked like they were just testing the weapon's effectiveness in different terrain." Michael moved to the filing cabinets and started pulling out folders, each one revealing another piece of a puzzle that had been deliberately scattered and buried. Photographs showed a small team of men in radiation suits, some of them standing near equipment that looked primitive by modern standards, but had been cutting-edge science in the final days of World War II. Other photos showed the aftermath of the detonation, a crater that had been carefully measured and documented before being filled in and hidden under tons of dirt and concrete. But it was a handwritten journal tucked in the bottom drawer that made Michael stop breathing for several seconds. The cover bore a name written in neat block letters: Dr. James Harrison, lead physicist. Michael's grandfather, his father's father, the man who had died when Michael was just 7 years old, the man whose past had always been shrouded in deliberate vagueness and classified restrictions that prevented him from ever discussing his war work. Rebecca saw what he was holding and moved closer, her work light illuminating pages that had been written in the same hand that had signed birthday cards Michael still kept in a box at home. "Dad," she said softly. Grandpa knew. He was part of this. Michael opened the journal with hands that felt numb, and his grandfather's words, written in August 1945, began to tell a story that explained everything, and changed everything, and made the weight of family secrets feel suddenly unbearable. August 5th, 1945. "We have been ordered to transport Device Charlie to the Arizona facility for disposal detonation. I argued against this course of action in the strongest possible terms. The site has not been properly surveyed for groundwater contamination risks. The prevailing winds will carry fallout directly toward Dust Creek, a civilian settlement of approximately 2,000 people. Colonel Morrison overruled my objections, citing urgency and security concerns. We proceed tomorrow, August 7, 1945. Device was detonated at 0600 hours. Yield approximately 15 kilotons, consistent with projections. However, wind patterns shifted unexpectedly during night. Fallout plume moved northeast instead of southeast as predicted. Dust Creek is directly in the path. I have informed Colonel Morrison that immediate evacuation protocols must be initiated. He has refused, stating that acknowledging the test would compromise national security. Population must be monitored but not informed. August 10th, 1945. I can no longer remain silent. The radioactive contamination levels in Dust Creek exceed safe exposure limits by a factor of 40. Children are playing in contaminated dust. Families are drinking from wells that show elevated radiation in every sample I have tested. I have prepared a formal report for the Manhattan Project Oversight Committee, documenting the unauthorized test and its consequences. Colonel Morrison has threatened me with charges of treason if I submit this report. I have a wife and infant son, but I also have a conscience that will not allow me to watch 2,000 people die slowly from radiation poisoning while I stay silent. The journal continued for another dozen pages, each entry more desperate than the last, until the final entry dated August 15, 1945, the day Japan surrendered and the war ended, and the world's attention turned toward peace celebrations rather than toward uncomfortable questions about what had been done in the desert to win that peace. They have sealed the facility, James Harrison had written. All records are to be destroyed. All personnel are to sign secrecy oaths under threat of prosecution. I am being transferred to a teaching position at a university far from here, which is their way of ensuring my silence. I cannot fight this. I have tried and failed, but I am hiding copies of everything in this bunker. Someday, perhaps, when enough time has passed and the people responsible are dead, and justice can be served without destroying the careers of innocent men who were simply following orders, someone will find this evidence. Someone will tell the truth about what happened at Dust Creek. I pray that person has more courage than I have shown. Michael closed the journal, his grandfather's confession weighing on him with the force of personal betrayal, even though he understood intellectually that the man had been trapped in an impossible situation. Rebecca was crying silently, tears making tracks through the dust that covered her face. He tried, she said. Grandpa tried to do the right thing and they destroyed him for it. And then they buried the evidence so deep that it took 80 years and a government surplus auction for anyone to find it, Michael added. Which means Dust Creek, those 2,000 people his grandfather had tried to warn, they've been living with radiation exposure for 8 decades without knowing why their cancer rates were astronomical, or why their children were born with defects, or why their town slowly died as families moved away from a place that felt cursed, but nobody could explain why. We have to expose this, Rebecca said, her voice hardening with determination that Michael recognized because he'd heard the same tone in his own voice when he'd made decisions that changed the course of his life. Those families deserve to know. Grandpa deserves to have his courage recognized instead of being remembered as just another physicist who worked on classified projects. But even as she spoke, they heard the sound that Michael had been dreading. Vehicles above them, multiple engines moving fast across the desert, arriving with the kind of timing that suggested they'd been watching and waiting for exactly this moment when Michael and Rebecca were trapped underground with evidence that powerful people could not allow to see daylight. Gordon Vance had returned, and this time Michael suspected there would be no polite offers or legal threats, just the kind of permanent solution that made problems disappear into the same desert that had swallowed the truth about Dust Creek 80 years ago. The sound of boots on metal echoed down through the opening above them. Heavy footsteps that belonged to men who weren't trying to hide their approach because they knew their targets were trapped in a concrete box 20 feet underground with only one way out. Michael grabbed his work light and swept it across the bunker, looking for something he knew probably didn't exist. Another exit, a ventilation shaft, anything that would give them options besides climbing directly into whatever Gordon Vance had planned for them. Rebecca was frantically photographing documents with her phone, her fingers flying across the screen as she uploaded images to cloud storage, to her university email, to every backup location she could think of in the 30 seconds they might have before Vance's men reached the bottom of the ladder. If we don't make it out, she said, her voice remarkably steady considering their situation, at least the evidence will survive. A flashlight beam cut through the darkness above them, and then Gordon Vance's voice echoed down into the bunker, amplified by the concrete walls in a way that made it sound like the voice of God pronouncing judgment. Mr. Harrison, Miss Harrison, I really wish you'd taken my offer when it was on the table. Now we have a much more complicated situation to resolve. Michael positioned himself at the base of the ladder, a heavy pry bar in his hands, knowing it was a pathetic weapon against men who probably carried guns, but needing to hold something that gave him even the illusion of being able to protect his daughter. We've already uploaded everything, he called back. Photos of the documents, the test records, my grandfather's journal. You can kill us, but you can't stop the truth from getting out. There was a pause, and Michael could hear voices above having a rapid conversation that he couldn't quite make out. Then Vance spoke again, and his tone had shifted from threatening to something that sounded almost like respect, mixed with resignation. Then I suppose we need to talk about this like reasonable people instead of treating it as a problem that can be disappeared. I'm coming down, alone and unarmed. I'd appreciate the same courtesy from you. Michael looked at Rebecca, who shrugged in a gesture that communicated they didn't have much choice at this point. Fine, Michael called back. But if anyone else starts down that ladder, I'm assuming the conversation is over. Vance descended slowly, his expensive suit completely inappropriate for climbing into underground bunkers but somehow still immaculate despite the dust and heat. He reached the bottom and stood there in the work light's harsh illumination, looking at the spread of documents across the table with an expression that Michael couldn't immediately read. Might have been regret, might have been calculation, might have been both. You've found quite a story, Vance said, picking up one of the photographs of the detonation crater. Unauthorized nuclear test, civilian population exposed to fallout, 80-year cover-up. If this goes public, it'll be one of the biggest scandals in American history. Heads will roll, careers will be destroyed, and Dust Creek, what's left of it, will sue the federal government for enough money to bankrupt a small country. Sounds like justice to me, Rebecca said coldly. Justice, Vance repeated, as if tasting the word and finding it bitter. Miss Harrison, do you know how many people still live in Dust Creek? 47, down from 2,000 in 1945. The town's been dying slowly for 8 decades, and the 47 people who remain are mostly too old or too poor to leave. Justice for them means a payout they'll never live long enough to spend, because the litigation will take years and most of them will be dead before the first check arrives. That's not our problem, Michael said. Our problem is making sure the truth comes out so it can't happen again. Vance set down the photograph and turned to face them directly, his expression serious in a way that suggested he was about to say something he actually meant, rather than something calculated to manipulate. I'm not going to threaten you, he said. Not going to offer you money anymore. I'm going to tell you the truth about why I'm here and what's really at stake, and then you can make an informed decision about whether exposing this serves justice or just serves your own sense of moral superiority. Michael kept the pry bar ready, but nodded for Vance to continue. My company has been monitoring this site for 12 years, Vance began, pacing slowly in the confined space. Not because we wanted to mine radioactive materials, though I understand why you'd assume that. We've been monitoring because the contamination from that 1945 test is spreading. Groundwater flows from this site directly toward Phoenix, and the radioactive isotopes in the soil are slowly, very slowly, leaching into the aquifer that supplies drinking water to 5 million people. Rebecca's expression shifted from anger to concern. How slowly? At current rates, contamination will reach Phoenix's water supply in approximately 30 to 40 years. Not immediately dangerous, but enough to significantly increase cancer rates across the entire metropolitan area, unless the source is contained and cleaned up properly. So clean it up, Michael said. That's what the EPA is for. Vance laughed without humor. The EPA has a budget of $9 billion a year to handle environmental disasters across the entire United States. Properly remediating this site would cost between $8 and $12 billion over 15 years. That's more than the EPA's entire annual budget. Do you seriously think Congress is going to appropriate that kind of money to clean up a disaster from 1945 that most people don't know about, and that won't affect anyone for another generation? Then what's your solution? Rebecca asked. My company has been developing a proprietary remediation technique, Vance explained. Uses advanced polymer barriers to contain the contamination and prevent it from spreading. Cost about $800 million, which we can fund through private capital if the federal government gives us clear title to the property and protection from liability lawsuits. We clean up the site, prevent a future disaster in Phoenix, and the cost to taxpayers is zero. And you make how much profit? Michael asked skeptically. About $200 million over 10 years, assuming everything goes perfectly, which it never does. Not a fortune by corporate standards, but enough to justify the risk and investment. Rebecca had her phone out, typing rapidly. If your technique is so effective, why not just share it with the EPA? Why does it have to be your company? Because we developed it, which means we own the patents, and because the EPA moves at the speed of government bureaucracy while we can start work within months of securing the necessary approvals. Vance pulled out his own phone and brought up what looked like detailed engineering schematics. I'm not the villain you want me to be, Mr. Harrison. I'm a businessman who saw a disaster that nobody in government wanted to acknowledge and figured out how to fix it in a way that makes economic sense. Michael looked at his daughter, seeing his own uncertainty reflected in her expression. By exposing this publicly, they'd force government action, but that action might take years or even decades to actually accomplish anything, and in the meantime the contamination would continue spreading toward millions of people who had no idea they were at risk. But staying silent meant letting Vance's company profit from cleaning up a mess that the government had created, which felt like rewarding the wrong people for doing the right thing. Why should we believe anything you're saying? Rebecca finally asked. You showed up with fake EPA reports and legal threats. You've been trying to intimidate us from the beginning. Because I thought you'd take the money and walk away like any rational person would, Vance admitted. I didn't expect you to be stupid enough, brave enough, whatever you want to call it, to actually dig down here and find the evidence. Now that you have, threatening you is pointless, and killing you creates more problems than it solves, so I'm trying honesty, which frankly is not my preferred approach, but seems to be the only option left. A voice called down from above. Vance's voice, but different. Younger. Boss, we've got company. Federal vehicles approaching from the east. All three of them looked up toward the opening that led to the surface. Vance's expression went from calculated to genuinely worried. Did you contact federal authorities before coming here today? No, Michael said. We were planning to, but we wanted to secure the evidence first. Then someone else has been monitoring this site, Vance said quietly. Someone with enough resources to track our movements and enough authority to deploy federal agents. He looked at Michael with something that might have been respect. Congratulations, Mr. Harrison. You've attracted attention from people who make me look like a harmless businessman. The sound of vehicles stopping above them was followed by the unmistakable noise of multiple people deploying quickly and professionally, voices calling out commands in the clipped tones of law enforcement or military personnel running an operation they'd carefully planned. A new voice echoed down into the bunker, female and authoritative in a way that suggested she was used to being obeyed immediately. This is Special Agent Sarah Chen with the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. Everyone in the bunker needs to exit immediately with their hands visible. This is a contaminated site, and you're all in violation of federal law by being here without proper authorization and safety protocols. Michael and Rebecca exchanged glances. Going up meant facing arrest, but staying down meant potentially being trapped if the federal agents decided to seal the bunker before sorting out jurisdiction and liability. Vance was already moving toward the latter, his hands raised, clearly having decided that dealing with federal agents was preferable to being buried alive in a concrete tomb. They climbed out one by one, emerging into afternoon sunlight that felt blinding after the darkness below, and found themselves surrounded by a dozen people in hazmat suits, portable radiation detectors, and the kind of serious expressions that suggested this was not their first time dealing with unauthorized access to contaminated sites. Special Agent Chen was in her 40s, Asian features, no-nonsense body language, and eyes that assessed Michael with the intensity of someone trained to spot lies before they were even spoken. Mr. Harrison, she said, consulting a tablet that apparently had his entire life story loaded on it. Retired Army combat engineer. Purchased this property 3 days ago at government auction, and somehow in those 3 days managed to discover a secret that's been successfully hidden for 80 years. That's either remarkably bad luck or remarkably good detective work. My grandfather worked here, Michael said simply, deciding that honesty was probably his best option at this point. He left records. I was just following his trail. Dr. James Harrison, Chen confirmed, scrolling through information on her tablet. Manhattan Project physicist. Worked on weapons development 1943 through 1946. Died 1968. She looked up from the screen. What you found here, Mr. Harrison, is a matter of national security that's been actively monitored and managed by the federal government since 1947. The fact that it was sold at auction was an administrative error that we've been trying to correct since the moment we discovered it. By trying to correct it, you mean trying to bury it again? Rebecca said, her voice sharp with anger. My grandfather documented an unauthorized nuclear test that poisoned 2,000 people. That's not national security. That's criminal negligence. Chen's expression didn't change. Dr. Harrison, I understand your frustration, but the situation is more complicated than you realize. The Dust Creek exposure has been monitored continuously for 78 years. Every resident receives free medical care through a program disguised as a rural health initiative. Their cancer rates are tracked. Their treatment is funded. The government has been taking care of them while trying to prevent panic and litigation that would accomplish nothing except making lawyers rich. That's a rationalization, not justice, Rebecca shot back. That's pragmatism in a world where perfect justice isn't always possible, Chen replied. She turned back to Michael. You've uncovered evidence of serious historical wrongdoing. What happens next depends on what you want to accomplish. Do you want revenge against people who've been dead for 50 years? Do you want a public scandal that destroys confidence in government institutions? Or do you want actual solutions that help the people who are still alive and at risk? Michael looked at the bunker opening, at the evidence scattered in the darkness below, at his daughter whose expression told him she was ready to fight this, all the way to the Supreme Court if necessary, and at Gordon Vance who stood off to the side looking like a man who just realized his careful plans had been completely derailed by forces beyond his control. What Michael Harrison wanted was simple. He wanted the truth acknowledged, and the people hurt by that truth to receive justice. But Special Agent Chen's question made him realize that truth and justice were sometimes two different things, and choosing between them might be the hardest decision he'd ever have to make. Special Agent Chen led them to a mobile command center that had been set up near the base entrance, a large trailer equipped with computers, communication systems, and air conditioning that felt like stepping into paradise after hours in the desert heat. Inside, 3 other agents were monitoring data streams that Michael didn't fully understand, radiation readings and satellite imagery, and what looked like legal documents being transmitted in real time to people whose decisions would determine what happened next. Sit, Chen said, gesturing to chairs around a conference table that seemed absurdly normal given the circumstances. I'm going to show you something that's been classified for 78 years, and then we're going to discuss what comes next. She pulled up files on a large monitor mounted to the trailer wall, and Michael found himself looking at photographs of Dust Creek from 1945, a small town that looked prosperous and alive, children playing in streets, families gathered outside a general store, the kind of American community that existed in thousands of places across the country. Then Chen brought up more recent images. The same streets nearly empty, buildings abandoned, a ghost town dying slowly without anyone understanding why. The government has been monitoring Dust Creek since August 1945, Chen explained. Every resident's medical records are tracked through a database that's been continuously maintained for nearly 8 decades. Cancer rates are 390% above national average. Birth defects occur at 5 times the normal rate. Average life expectancy is 14 years below the national mean. And every single one of these statistics has been carefully documented and hidden from public view. Why? Rebecca demanded. Why hide it instead of helping them? We did help them, Chen replied, bringing up more documents. See this rural health clinic that opened in Dust Creek in 1948? Staffed by doctors who were actually military physicians monitoring radiation exposure under civilian cover. Every resident receives free medical care, free cancer treatment, free genetic counseling. The government has spent over $200 million over the past 78 years taking care of those families, while lying to them about why they were sick, Michael said quietly. Yes, Chen admitted without hesitation, because telling them the truth in 1948 would have meant admitting to an unauthorized nuclear test, which would have destroyed public confidence in the Manhattan Project, potentially given the Soviet Union propaganda ammunition during the early Cold War, and opened the government to lawsuits that could have bankrupted the nuclear program before it even fully began. And now? Rebecca pressed. What's the excuse now? Now, Chen said, her voice taking on a tone that suggested she was about to reveal something significant. We have 47 people still living in Dust Creek, and we have contamination spreading toward Phoenix's water supply, and we have approximately 30 years before 5 million people are drinking radioactive water. The question isn't whether we fix this. The question is how we fix it without causing mass panic or political paralysis. Gordon Vance, who'd been sitting quietly in the corner, spoke up for the first time. My company's polymer barrier technique can contain the contamination for a fraction of what traditional remediation would cost. We've been trying to get federal approval for 3 years, but the EPA won't move forward without acknowledging why the site needs remediation, which means acknowledging the 1945 test. So everyone's stuck, Michael said, understanding finally clicking into place. The government can't clean up the site without admitting what happened. Vance can't implement his solution without government approval. And meanwhile, the contamination keeps spreading. Exactly, Chen confirmed. Until you bought this property and found your grandfather's documentation, we were managing a slow-moving disaster with no good solutions. Now she pulled up new documents. We have an opportunity to actually fix this, but only if everyone in this room agrees to work together instead of fighting each other in court for the next 20 years. Rebecca crossed her arms, her professor's instinct to distrust government explanations warring with her scientist's understanding of the real problem they faced. What are you proposing? Chen brought up what looked like a detailed plan, multiple documents, timelines, budget allocations. We acknowledge the 1945 test publicly, she said. Full disclosure, no more lies. We apologize to the Dust Creek families and provide compensation. We fund Vance's remediation using a combination of federal dollars and private investment. And we establish new protocols to prevent anything like this from ever happening again. Sounds perfect, Michael said, his tone making clear he suspected there was a catch. What's the price? The price is you, Chen replied, looking directly at him. This story needs a hero. Someone the public can rally around. Someone whose motives are pure and whose connection to the victims is personal. You're the grandson of a Manhattan Project physicist who tried to blow the whistle and was silenced. You bought the property by accident and discovered evidence your grandfather hid 80 years ago. You fought against corporate interests and government secrecy to reveal the truth. That's a narrative people can believe and support. So I become the face of this, Michael said slowly. Do interviews, testify before Congress, help sell the cleanup plan to skeptical taxpayers. Yes, Chen said. And in exchange, the Dust Creek families get full compensation. The contamination gets cleaned up before it reaches Phoenix, and your grandfather's courage gets recognized instead of remaining buried in classified files. Everyone wins. Except Gordon Vance profits from this, Rebecca interjected, looking at the businessman with undisguised distrust. He tried to intimidate us, threatened us with fake legal documents, and now he gets an $800 million government contract? Vance stood up, his expression serious in a way Michael hadn't seen before. Miss Harrison, I'm not going to pretend I'm a good person. I saw an opportunity to make money solving a problem that needed solving. I used intimidation because I thought it would work faster than honesty. I was wrong. He turned to face Special Agent Chen. If my company's involvement is preventing this deal from happening, cut us out. License our polymer barrier technique to the EPA for $1. Let them implement it. I'll take no profit if that's what it takes to get this done. The trailer went silent. Chen looked genuinely surprised, which Michael suspected didn't happen often to someone in her position. Rebecca's expression shifted from anger to confusion, as if Vance's offer had broken the simple narrative of corporate villainy she'd been building in her mind. Why? Rebecca finally asked. Why would you walk away from hundreds of millions in profit? Because I grew up in Tucson, Vance said quietly. My mother died of leukemia when I was 12. Doctors never could explain why. She'd lived her whole life in Arizona, drank the water, breathed the air, and something in that environment killed her. He gestured at the maps on the screen showing contamination patterns. If I'd known then what I know now, if someone had been honest about the risks, maybe she would have moved, maybe she would have lived. So yeah, I wanted to profit from fixing this, but I'd rather see it fixed than spend another decade fighting over who gets paid. Chen made some notes on her tablet, her fingers moving rapidly across the screen. If I can get approval for this structure, full disclosure, full compensation, EPA implemented remediation using licensed private technology at cost, everyone in this room agrees to support the plan publicly. Michael looked at his daughter, seeing his own uncertainty reflected in her face. This wasn't the simple justice they'd imagined, wasn't the dramatic exposure of villains and vindication of heroes. This was compromise and pragmatism and accepting that the best possible outcome wasn't always the perfect outcome, but it was also 2,000 people finally understanding why their families had suffered, and 5 million people in Phoenix being protected from a disaster they didn't know was coming, and his grandfather's courage finally being recognized instead of dismissed. I have one condition, Michael said. The 47 people still living in Dust Creek, they get to decide. We present them with the full truth, show them this plan, and let them vote on whether to accept the compensation and support the cleanup or to fight for something more through the courts. Their lives, their choice. Chen considered this for a moment, then nodded. Agreed. We present the plan in Dust Creek within 1 week. Public meeting, full transparency, and the residents vote. 5 days later, Michael Harrison stood in the Dust Creek Community Center, a building that had once hosted town meetings and school plays but now held only 47 people, the remnants of a community that had been slowly poisoned for 8 decades without understanding why. The room smelled like old wood and dust and the accumulated sadness of a place that had watched itself die without explanation. Special Agent Chen presented the evidence with clinical precision: the photographs of the 1945 detonation, the documentation of contamination, the medical tracking that proved the government had known all along what was killing these families. She presented the compensation package: $2 million per surviving resident, full medical care for life, and a public apology from the highest levels of government. She presented the cleanup plan that would prevent the contamination from spreading to Phoenix. And then she presented Michael, who stood before these people with his grandfather's journal in his hands, and told them about James Harrison, a physicist who'd tried to warn them and had been silenced, who'd hidden evidence hoping that someday someone would find it and finish what he'd started. "Your families deserved the truth 80 years ago," Michael said, his voice steady despite emotions that threatened to overwhelm him. "My grandfather tried to give you that truth and failed. I can't change the past, but I can make sure the future is different, that your suffering is acknowledged, that the people responsible are held accountable even if most of them are long dead, and that what happened here never happens to another community." The vote was unanimous. 47 people raised their hands in favor of accepting the plan, not because they thought it was perfect justice, but because they understood that perfect justice didn't exist for disasters that had already happened, and preventing future disasters was the closest thing to redemption any of them would ever see. 6 months later, Michael stood at the edge of what had once been Yucca Flat Station, and was now the Harrison Remediation Site, named after his grandfather, whose courage had finally been publicly recognized. The cleanup was ahead of schedule, Vance's polymer barriers working exactly as promised, containing contamination that would have reached Phoenix's water supply in another generation. The 47 residents of Dust Creek had their compensation, their medical care, and most importantly, their answers about why their town had died. Rebecca had written a book about the discovery, a detailed academic work that was somehow also climbing bestseller lists because people were hungry for stories about hidden truth finally coming to light. Gordon Vance had kept his word, licensing his technology to the EPA for $1 and walking away from hundreds of millions in profit, though Michael suspected the publicity had been worth more to his company's reputation than any contract could have provided. And Michael himself had become something he'd never expected: a voice for government transparency and environmental justice, testifying before Congress, speaking at universities, telling the story of how a $3,000 purchase at a government auction had uncovered an 80-year conspiracy and led to changes that would protect millions of people from repeating the mistakes of the past. He thought often about his grandfather, about the impossible choice James Harrison had faced between speaking truth and protecting his family, about how the evidence he'd hidden in that bunker had waited 8 decades for someone to find it, and about how sometimes the courage to do right wasn't about dramatic gestures but about trusting that truth, even when buried deep, would eventually find its way back to the light. The desert stretched endlessly around him, red sand and distant mountains and heat that made the air shimmer, the same landscape that had witnessed the detonation of an atomic bomb in 1945, and had kept that secret buried for longer than most people lived. But secrets, Michael had learned, were like radioactive contamination. They might be buried deep and hidden well, but they never really disappeared. They just waited for someone brave enough or stubborn enough or lucky enough to dig until they found what had been lost. He'd bought a military base for $3,000. He'd found his grandfather's hidden truth. And in doing so, he'd discovered that sometimes the best investment wasn't measured in profit or property, but in the courage to keep digging when everyone else told you to stop, to keep asking questions when silence would have been easier, and to finish what someone started long before you were born, because justice delayed might not be justice perfected, but it was still better than justice denied forever. Thank you for joining us on this incredible journey of discovery, conspiracy, and redemption. If this story moved you, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe to our channel for more amazing true stories that prove truth is often stranger and more powerful than fiction. Drop a comment telling us what you thought, And click the next video to hear another tale of ordinary people who stumbled onto extraordinary secrets. Your support means everything to us.